離地新聞逢星期四晚6點半，同大家放眼全球，探索未來。好，第二節嘅離地新聞，大家好，我係 Titus。今日我哋嘅嘉賓咧，繼續係有呢個 HKDC 嘅創辦人同組織總監朱牧民先生阿 Samuel， 同埋洛杉磯香港論壇發言人阿 Charles 嘅，歡迎兩位。係啦，咁首先我哋即係自從呢個拜登喺1月20號就任總統至今咧，我諗其實咧，有幾樣嘢咧，我哋可以 trace 嘅。雖然咧，我諗兩位都應該同意，即係其實somehow你哋其中一位都曾經講過話，即係如果你要睇即係拜登整體嘅對華政策，可能要等半年先至睇到個全面嘅 picture。咁但係我諗其實而家3個月之後，我諗基本上都叫做有啲 trend 㗎啦，可以睇到㗎啦。咁我哋首先咧，由國會嗰度睇起先，咁即係點講啊？即係其實國會而家係咪仲有一啲嘅立法正在進行中，係針對中國嘅咧？嗱，我即刻諗到嘅就會係呢個就係例如之前 Donald Trump 提及係針對呢個華為嘅 5G 嘅 equipment 啦，針對 TikTok 同埋呢一個 WeChat 啦，咁以及有冇一啲新嘅一啲嘅立法而家喺度進行中係針對緊中國嘅咧？其實。
So starting with I think that's a great question about Congress. So starting with Congress, so as many of you know, so this is a new Congress. So Congress runs on a 2-year calendar, and so I would say that we are now in the middle of probably the most significant developing of China policy that we have had in a very long time. One of the things that I think was clear during the last 4 years of the last 2 Congress is that even though there were a lot of talk about China, there was never really a coherent, comprehensive approach to pushing back and countering China's influence, right? You cited some of the other proposals from last year, TikTok, it was a great talking point, but it wasn't really a viable policy solution on the table. And so right now, there are a couple of things that are happening in Congress. I think it was important that at the new Congress, at the start of the new Congress, last week, actually as part of our conference, the House of Representatives voted on a new resolution to reaffirm its support for Hong Kong and the protests. It's, sometimes people, think, it's just another resolution. But I think it's important to remember that this is a new Congress, there are new people, there are members that are just here for the first time. Getting everybody reset to a place where they're, committed publicly to Hong Kong, I think it's important. We continue to have a number of Hong Kong specific measures. We talked about all of this last week at the conference about refugee designation, a bill to support circumventing potential firewalls in Hong Kong on the internet, looking at specifically censorship of U.S. companies and entities when they speak out in support of Hong Kong or against China, and how we actually deal with those kind of censorship experience. And then there's a much larger, right now, a bill that we're working on and supporting, in different parts, called the Strategic Competition Act and the Endless Frontier Act, which are 2 very large China-specific legislation that is currently working its way through Senate. So last week, actually, as part of our conference, we talked about different ways in which we want to shape these legislation. Not all of them, majority of the legislation has nothing to do with Hong Kong specifically, but these bills will set the tone from, how we invest in technology to compete with China to how we, address censorship in U.S., on the U.S. soil, to how we want to compete on the internet. So these are all things that are being packaged together. I think this is one of those things I think people need to remember is that Congress and lawmaking is a very messy process. So, it's very rare that, when we had the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, it was one bill, it was a standalone, it worked its way through both houses and then got signed into law. That is not often, a majority of the time, not how lawmaking works in the US. There's a lot of times where things are put together, combined together in a very complex mix. And there's a lot of negotiation. There are different committees and different members that have different roles. So right now, I think the next step that we're seeing in Congress, besides sort of the most immediate around refugees and around other internet access, is these two big China bills that will hopefully come to the Senate, full Senate, at the end of May and maybe beginning of June. And that is already taking a very, very fast pace. And I think people, we just need to remember that lawmaking takes time. And the process is always complicated. There's a lot of negotiation and a lot of compromise that has to happen. But Congress is very much focused right now, beyond the pandemic that you've seen. China and the China policy is a huge priority that is going to be coming up next in May and June.
Okay, so Charles， 你有咩回應咧？對於頭先提及呢一堆呢啲嘅法案？
我其實好同意嘅。咁呢個新嗰兩個標啦，呢個 Strategic Competition Act 同埋 Endless Frontier Act 咧，似乎以佢嗰個容量嚟講啊，即係呢個標嘅長度嚟講咧，咁似乎咧亦都係Congress 係用咗好多心機咧去寫出嚟嘅。咁所以我覺得咧，就呢兩個標咧睇嚟都係嚟真嘅啦。咁但係好似阿 Samuel 咁講咧，其實通過法案係需要時間。咁我哋可以做嘅就係會繼續同啲議員傾偈啊，同佢講話我哋支持呢啲標咁樣啦。咁我亦都想知道喺 HKDC 嗰方面係咪會唔會有一啲相應嘅行動，我哋可以一齊參與或者寫信啊、打電話啊之類咁樣可以協助一下咧。
Yeah, so I think it's really important that the process sometimes could be very complicated to a point where it turns people off, and say oh, I just don't understand. Like you said, just let HKDC or let Samuel or let Charles do it, because they are the ones who can keep up. I think that those are not the only two options and not mutually exclusive. I think that acknowledging that the process is complicated just means that we have to work harder to teach people what the process is. So for example, last week during the conference, we made it clear we wanted people for, on Monday and Tuesday, we asked them to call the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to see if they could attach some of our provisions on refugees onto the larger bill that they were taking up. But the tension there is always that, by the time that once they came around when the committee was meeting, it became clear that we were probably better off if we did not attach those provisions because there were other pressure and other disagreements that has nothing to do with Hong Kong necessarily. And so it is hard, it is complicated, and I think sometimes that that turns people off at times because they're like, oh, you just told us on Monday that you want us to do this, and then now on Wednesday you said that just changed. Well, that is the honest truth of what happened. In the process of advocating for these things, we have to also be flexible and nimble because we're negotiating with real people in real time. So I think what I would suggest that we do is that I do think that it's up to people like us, Charles, and others who have some experience at HKDC, who is obviously doing this full time, to be much more active in teaching people how the process works each step of the way. It doesn't mean that we're always going to be able to tell everybody everything because a lot of this happens quickly. It happens behind the scene, and sometimes we might not be able to explain everything fully. But I think that we have to do more to educate and teach people the politics and how it works so that we all become expert in the process, so that you and someone else who is from San Francisco or in Texas can explain to other people this is what our priority is, and this is how we're going to get there. Because I think right now, again, I think that people sometimes just don't have yet the exposure to how Washington, D.C. and Congress and the White House and the administration really works beyond what they see on social media or what they see in the news.
Okay, talk about
我諗
news.
香港人亦都可能，我覺得香港人亦都係可能由於呢一個反送中運動咧，而好似習慣咗咧，就係美國嘅政策可能係一件好快可以達成嘅事，就係其實係因為香港之前嗰個 urgency 令到咧美國政府嗰個反應咁快，但係實際上咧有好多時有好多嘢咧係需要好長時間咧先至可以實行得到嘅，咁而阻住呢個法案通過嘅，可能一啲同香港完全冇關嘅嘢係會發生嘅。咁我都想講，我知道 Sammy 其實都未必中意呢套電視劇就係 The West Wing 啦。咁 West Wing 咧就可能將白宮嗰個情況咧就浪漫化咗，同埋可能亦都係即係唔係即係同事實可能有啲出入。但係有啲嘢咧，佢嗰個 element 都做得幾好嘅，即係例如佢喺想討論法案嘅時候，佢有時有啲飛來馬里係唔知道點解會無端端個法案唔通過，係因為有第啲人有啲完全唔關事嘅原因。咁我覺得呢一樣嘢咧，其實係好反映到呢個國會正常嘅運作咧係咁樣樣嘅。咁我第一次睇我都覺得好新鮮啊，好 inspiring。我覺得哇，即係原來係咁刺激嘅，有時啲嘢都幾特別。咁後尾再第二次睇咧，我就覺得好似有啲 silly 咁樣，有啲無謂。不過即係我覺得佢有啲元素係都講得幾好嘅。咁我如果大家未睇過都可以睇一睇，咁樣可以明白多少少有時啲嘢係點解會無端端發生。
係咁樣咧就講到呢度嘅時候咧，頭先阿 Samuel 都講到好多有關新聞嘅嘢啦。其實近排我發覺新聞好集中於討論新疆嗰方面嘅問題，即係 especially 就係話近排其實美國、加拿大都已經有啦。最新嘅就係英國，就係啱啱好似若果冇記錯係上個禮拜定再上個禮拜就已經即係國會通過，就係認為即係一個 resolution 就認為咧，即係新疆正在進行緊嘅係一個種族滅絕嘅行為咁樣。咁樣就有少少其實有少少唔係好同 Donald Trump 嗰陣時嘅年代唔係好同嘅，就係的而且確就係話好多美國針對中國嘅一啲嘅政策啊，或者一啲嘅手段咧，其實都有少少係，亦都有經手，就係美國嘅盟友去進行。好似較早前就係話就係對新疆官員嘅制裁咧，最先宣布嘅咧係歐盟，然之後美國同加拿大先至跟進嘅咁樣。咁其實美國同埋美國喺好多地方佢都好似係即係有好多嘢係先同盟友講完傾完啦，然之後一齊推個政策出嚟。你覺得呢一個嘅方式同以前嘅方法嘅利弊嗰方面，究竟係有啲即係嘅利弊係咩嘢咧
？So I think that there are a couple of things that you touch on that I think are important for people to remember. I think that forced labor in particular and treatment of minority is not a new issue in China. I mean, this has happened 30 years ago. It has been ongoing. But I do think that this newest push and I think public awareness is an important moment for all of us in all the different protest movement against China. One thing I think that is important to note in the last 3 months is that even though, again, we talked a lot about China in the last 4 years, we had it was difficult because the U.S. had very little coordination with other countries in the last 4 years under the last administration. I think that's a really important thing that people have to remember, is that we spent a lot of time fighting with our friends, so we didn't really do anything together with them. And different now, because when China, let's say 30 years ago, when China was just becoming open economically, it was very easy for the U.S. to be the big negotiator and say that, if we grant you the most favored nation status, then that's really the big thing that China wanted and needed. China joining the WTO was the big thing that they really needed, and the U.S. held the key to it. In 2021, that's not the case anymore. The U.S. alone can't actually, it's not like we can sanction North Korea or even Iran, and do it the same way with China, because it is a much larger, much more globalized economy. And, we missed some of those opportunities, 20, 30 years ago to really, I think, connect human rights in the trade and economics. So now we're in a place where we do need to work with the EU. We do need to work with a number of other entities together, because we're not in an environment where China is small enough that just the US or just the UK is going to be enough to put pressure. And I do think that this newest Xinjiang, and particularly the Xinjiang cotton conversation and the genocide and the Olympics, raises another really important point, which is that just as China is now more, confident, or they're more aggressive globally because they feel like they have a seat at the table, it also means that they care a lot about what people perceptions and the PR that they get on the global stage. And I think that what has happened in the last year, in particular in the last 18 months, is that China clearly understands that their global standing has taken a nosedive because of COVID, because of the pandemic. You now see more companies, corporations, willing to come out and say that we're not going to do, we're not just going to say, stay quiet on this. And it's still very much in the beginning. It's still very much in this nascent stage. But I think that these are things that, again, on top of actual economic sanction, on top of negotiation like the ongoing saga with the technology trade deal that the EU is still, it's in limbo right now with China. But on top of that, the more private sector is willing to finally say that, we're not going to come out and say that we love Xinjiang cotton, because that is just egregious and stupid for us to do. The more you're going to see the pressure actually working. But it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of work, because like you saw, when people started complaining and talking about how the Xinjiang cotton is genocide cotton, China has, pushed back and had their own PR campaign, and people came out in support and celebrated Xinjiang cotton. So I think that, there's definitely a moment here that is unique. Mm-hmm. That the pandemic has started, that the COVID virus, and then this genocide and Hong Kong has really given us an opening that I really think we need to take advantage of, because we don't have this opportunity very often.
Oh, okay. So I guess it is also 都同佢哋嘅利潤有啲關係啦。老實講句，我諗係因為其實以前佢哋會即係會保住中國，即係我諗1989年6·4之後，有唔少嘅國家喺唔夠3-4年之內就已經翻去中國做生意，即係 which is 當年嘅 situation， 其實我諗6·4都係一個對中國嚟講，一個 PR 嚟講都係一個好大嘅損害嘅一樣嘢。但係今日嗰個武漢肺炎對全球嘅損害就唔係6·4只係殺咗喺北京天安門嘅學生咁簡單，而係真係影響到全球經濟。而原來我諗中國嗰個嘅 management 係咁差，即而且確對全球嘅影響係咁大嘅時候，所以我諗公司們都覺得就係話，我哋繼續喺中國做生意可能冇利益啊，會唔會其實就係因為呢一個原因咧？因為話其實仲有更深層次嘅一個原因，就係會唔會其實亦都係我哋自己買嘢，即係我哋成日都講啦，要 boycott 身份啦，啲中國人成日都用呢一招嘅，其實嚇，即係成日都用呢一招嘅，即係日本得罪我哋，跟住我哋就罷買日貨 something like that 咁樣，跟住就試過12節就係話試過示威就打爛啲日本車咁 something like that 呢啲咁嘅嘢，中國發生過㗎啦呢啲嘢。 但係好多時候中國就好多時候就係可能過咗唔知個零兩個禮拜又或者個零兩個月嘅時候就會翻嚟㗎啦。即係我諗一個最好笑嘅笑話就係成日都講嘅就係即係一個 AV 女郎叫做蒼井空嘅咧，就係中國嗰啲網民成日都話即係蒼井空係世界嘅，咁所以我哋就唔會杯葛呢個日本女星啦。咁 something like that 呢啲咁嘅嘢，呢咁嘅諗法啦。OK， 但係美國或者西方國家對於呢一個嗰個嘅制裁，對於嗰個罷買即係中國貨呢樣嘢，其實係咪真係因為佢哋係會比較 seriously 一啲，所以其實即係或者西方嘅公司有呢方面亦都開始係有少少顧忌咧？其實就係話會唔會？
So I mean, I don't know if Charles has his view. I think boycott. Let's put one thing that I think has to be clear is that boycott are very difficult to be successful at. There's been successful boycott in the past, but it's not that simple as tweeting about not buying stuff from a certain company. Because as you said, it doesn't always sustain enough to actually make a difference. Here's what I do think that matters, and in this case, I think it's unique. There is, I think, some real concerns for corporations. If you watch, for example, over the last year, people are asking where Jack Ma is, and watching, this idea that somehow Jack Ma was this example of how entrepreneurship and, economic capitalism in China is thriving. And, and then it disappeared. I think even on a level that people just on a basic general public level, that registers in people's mind that something doesn't seem right about what happened. Mm-hmm. And so are we actually dealing with an open system where business can actually thrive and are not, monitored and regulated and suppressed and, controlled by the central government? I think things like that they do matter in the aggregate of people thinking that, can I still do business in Hong Kong even, or in China, without looking behind my back and saying that, what if something happens, or what if this happens to us? So I think there's a real level of concern that I think happens. The second, I think, is that, on a messaging level, it does matter. Let's be honest, people talk about we're pushing hard on really highlighting the Olympics. The Olympics is a PR operation. And so you have to fight the PR where the PR is. Mm-hmm. So it's not just about I think that the pressure point for, making it clear that China should not be hosting the Olympics comes in shaming the American companies that are sponsoring the Olympics. So you have to be very strategic, because it doesn't just, it's not like, we boycott the Olympics. So for most people, that they don't even know what that means. None of us are going to the Olympics. So it's not like you not going is going to make a difference. But what is going to make a difference is if it makes it publicly unacceptable for American company to put their logo on a game that now majority of American believes is built on blood and genocides. That's how the pressure works. So economic pressure does work, but it has to be more strategic and sophisticated than just let's stop buying everything from China.
Charles, what do you think?
我都幾同意啦。咁我睇到嘅咧就係其實喺杯葛新疆棉方面咧，我喺網上睇到嘅咧就係好多人都話我杯葛啦咁樣。咁但係買嘢嘅時候又唔知點樣查究竟呢啲棉花喺邊度嚟啦。其實好難查到嘅。不過咧都可能有啲辦法嘅。不過咧我就睇到咧就係好多香港人想做喺呢啲咁嘅行動上邊咧，佢哋係尤其海外嗰啲咧就 似乎都係仍然有一個好圍爐嘅心態，就係自己同自己啲人講啊，話你唔好買呢啲啦，唔好買中國製造嘅衫啊，咁樣咁就算啦。咁但係同非香港人或者非中國人講嘅時候咧，其實就做唔到一個一個 buy in 啊。我覺得咧就係好多人都係即係話，而家新疆咁慘，你就自然要做啦。咁其實即係你要明，即係要做到有效咧，要係令到嚟海外嘅消費者明白咧，就係佢買呢一件嘅產物嘅時候咧，係有一個 moral cost 喺度嘅。佢哋要明白就係佢買嘅時候，可能係會令到新疆個情況更加惡劣。咁呢一樣嘢咧，其實係需要好長嘅時間去慢慢小心咁樣做，同埋要做好耐先得嘅。咁例如我俾一個好好例子咧，就係我住呢區呢一度喺60年代有一個 California Great Boycott。呢個 California Great Boycott 係最終係令到呢度嘅嗰啲 farm 嗰啲擁有人咧，係對於嗰啲喺嗰度做嗰啲 farmer 咧，係會有更加多嘅權利。咁呢一樣嘢咧係足係做咗15年嘅。咁所以我就話嘅意思咧就係好多時呢啲嘢咧唔係話一個3分鐘熱度嘅嘢，而亦都唔係話你一撻着咧全世界跟住就會跟住你做。你覺得好好咧，其實好多人都會需要時間去明白點解你覺得呢一樣嘢要值得做。咁係一個好長線嘅工作嚟嘅。咁我覺得就係呢樣嘢就係好似例如同即係游水一樣，就係你打好關係啊，呢啲咁嘅嘢咧，其實係需要慢慢時間去做。咁我亦都覺得咧係，如果有人係想做嘅話咧，其實係應該可以試下，但係咧你就要準備就係話你做呢一個 project 咧，係話我出幾個 Instagram post， 出幾個 Twitter post， 或者係同人講兩句就完。呢啲嘢咧係要長時間潛移默化咁去做，可能需要嘅時間咧係數年。即係你如果一做嘅話咧，我希望大家咧就係 commit 去做呢一樣嘢。而唔好話做得2-3個月，發現啲人都唔理嘅，咁你就放棄。因為其實你嗰個只係好前期嘅工作，即係如果你係希望有效果嘅話咧，你做嗰2個月其實只不過係 lay 咗個 groundwork， 而你睇到 effect 可能係數年以後嘅事。咁呢樣嘢我希望大家明白咯。
我諗其實都即係講到杯葛成功嘅例子，我諗針對南非嘅種族隔離政策嘅嗰個 boycott 係算係一個即係相當成功嘅例子，但係佢都延續咗10幾年，因為係一個好長遠嘅一樣嘢，而唔係即係三兩個月。即係陳奕迅突然間話取消去代言呢個 Adidas， 跟住我諗唔夠2個禮拜佢就已經開始後悔，因為佢原來要賠好多錢十分禮，但係即係唔係嗰啲咁嘅嘢咯。但係種族隔離嘅政策嗰個杯葛係延續咗好長嘅時間。當然亦都有唔少嘅有啲比較即係有啲人覺得有爭議嘅，例如針對以色列西岸嗰個即係嗰度出產嘅產品嘅一個杯葛，就有好多人就會質疑點解要杯葛呢個問題。我諗其實嗰個信息需要清楚同埋 consistent， 我諗都係一個好重要嘅一樣嘢啦。咁剩低幾分鐘嘅時間啫。我諗其實我諗喺呢一度或者我可以問一問成個問題，就係話總結而家3個月嘅時間裏面，其實美國政府對華政策嗰個成個嘅大方向係點咧？又或者係個國務卿 Antony Blinken 佢自己對中國嘅思考係點樣樣咧？會唔會因為我哋大家都記得就係話嗰陣時 Antony Blinken 都曾經即係佢未上任啦，即係 Donald Trump 仲在位嘅時候，佢就已經公開咁講就話Donald Trump 嘅好多政策都係正確嘅，雖然好多政策我哋唔即係個大方向係正確嘅，雖然好多政策我哋唔同意咁樣樣。即係其實佢至少佢會認同對華針對中國嘅呢一方面嗰個大方向，其實同Donald Trump 嗰樣嘢係相同或者相似啦。咁但係整體嚟講，而家美國新政府對於中國嘅睇法同埋嗰個政策嗰個大方向係點樣，或者嗰個評估係點樣？3個月之後。
Yeah, so I think that there was, again, this is something that we tried very hard to explain to Hong Kongers over the last 6 months, 9 months of the campaign and then the election, is that, our goal should always be that we want to make sure whoever is in the White House is responsive to what we want them to be able to do. So there's challenges and always sort of strengths and weaknesses on both sides. So I think that, like I already mentioned, I think the previous administration under former President Trump, there was a lot more public messaging around the threat and the risk and what was happening in China. But there was not really a lot of substantive things that were taking place. And when there was policy, it was more of a one-off, sporadic. It really helped because it raises the public support and awareness of the issues. I think that what you see now in the first 3 months of Biden is that number one, they have continued some of the most important public support. So they have continued to talk about Hong Kong consistently. They have moved to continue Blinken have agreed and the same designation that what's happening in Xinjiang is genocide. You have also seen, you saw their first meeting in Alaska a few weeks ago, and we were working with the administration leading up to the meeting. And you saw very clearly they weren't going to just go in and say, oh, as long as you do trade with us, we're all okay. They announced sanction right before, the day before the meeting, and had a very open, disagreement in the meeting. And I think that those continuation is important as one piece. The second thing I think is I am particularly encouraged by this, that there's now a much more concerted effort, both in Congress and in the administration, to really legislate coherently, to have an actual China strategy and legislation package that is going to address the wider holistic problem, not just this week we're talking about TikTok, next week is Confucius, this week is coronavirus, next week is trade tariff, and then all of a sudden we're saying that we want to negotiate trade deals and we forget about Xinjiang for now. So that doesn't really work well. So what I think is happening now is that I do think that we need a much more, I think, as we emerge from the pandemic, as we deal with some of the domestic challenges that we're dealing with, that I think we need to make clear that we're not going to, get distracted and saying, oh, we now, now that we have all these issues domestically, we got to focus on that. Or like what some people were afraid that, the Biden administration is going to care more about climate change than, human rights. I think what you're seeing now is that we can do all those things at the same time. It's not going to be easy, but we have to talk and we have to work on all these levels, because the one-dimensional back and forth of attacking each other on social media didn't really help us and get us anywhere. So I'm willing to try. I think in order for us to have a possibility and some hope of changes, is that we have to put pressure on all the different levels as much as possible. So I still believe that it will take some time for the policy to come into clarity, for us to really see what the administration is willing how far is willing to go. But I think that what we have seen so far in 3 months is that it has continued the right things and the right messages that the last administration has put in place. It has taken a proactive step to create a more holistic, coherent policy strategy. And it has left some space open to be much more firmer. I wish that the administration would come out and now and say that they really think that it's a shame to have the Olympics in 2022 in Beijing. They're close. I think they're getting there, but I think that they left themselves some room to be able to have some diplomatic negotiation. And I think that that's, I respect that and I accept that, but I think that it is up to us to put and keep the pressure on this administration to keep on this path that they're on.
OK， Charles 有冇啲本咩補充
啊？簡單一句啦，或者幾句啦。無論邊一個係主宰白宮，邊一個黨係喺國會度，或者我哋自己所屬嘅區域係屬於共和黨又好，民主黨又好，對於我哋對中國嘅睇法，對香港嘅議題嗰個倡議，其實都係照做㗎啦。可能個做法會有少少唔同，每一個唔理邊一個黨執政，可能個做法有少少都唔同，但係我哋唔會因為是但一個黨係執政而或者我哋嘅議員轉咗黨，我哋就唔會理佢。我哋而家有一個好難能可貴嘅兩黨共識，好似嗰日佩洛西咁講，就係話喺個議會度其實冇乜嘢係有兩黨共識，香港嘅議題同埋中國嘅議題係絕對有兩黨共識，咁我哋冇理由係放棄呢一樣嘢，所以我哋會繼續做。
係啦，咁啊時間差唔多啦。如果大家對我哋呢個禮拜嘅討論有進一步意見咧，可以喺 Facebook 搜尋呢個 Lady News LAYDYNEWS 一個字咧，就揾到我哋嘅 page 噶啦。我哋呢個節目每逢星期四多倫多時間晚上6點半到7點半，即係香港時間星期五早上6點半到7點半咧，喺離地民主後援 YouTube 頻道直播嘅。佢哋嘅 Facebook、Twitter、Instagram 同埋呢個 YouTube 嘅 handle 都一樣，都係呢個 Lady TV LAYDYTV 噶。喺 Patreon 上面搜尋 Lady TV 咧，就可以揾到我哋嘅 page 啦。課金5蚊可以提早半日收聽我哋嘅最新節目啦，課金10蚊可以聽到我哋失驚無神推出嘅離地突發時事分析㗎。此外，我哋同時喺各大嘅 podcast app， 即係 iTunes、Apple、Google Podcast 同埋 Spotify 咧，提供呢個聲音版本嘅。呢期離地新聞係2021年4月27號多倫多同華盛頓時間晚上8點，洛杉磯時間晏晝5點，即係香港時間4月28號早上8點錄影嘅。下星期再見，拜拜。